I'd like to hand over to Professor Friginal, who is going to talk about applied corpus linguistics and explorations of workplace discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sal. Thank you, Bernadette, for the introduction. And everybody, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all for being here. I can't see the names, but I see that close to 200 individuals are joining us. So from all over the world. So thank you for joining us. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm coming to you all from just outside Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest here in the US. It's past 10 p.m. my time, which is perfect because I'm a night owl and I enjoy staying up late. And this is one of those really precious opportunities to be staying up late for a very meaningful situation. So I'm very happy to be here. Kathleen, I hope to be there very, very soon. I hope this April. There have been really great developments so far. And so I hope to finally land in Hong Kong very, very soon. As Sal mentioned, you can see on the screen the title of my talk. I am a corpus linguist, and I have been very excited about corpus linguistics in 2022. It's a fascinating field to be in. Lots of things going on. Natural language processing is becoming a really big field in our area of applied linguistics. We have computational linguistics, language and computers, big data analytics, data science, and really fascinating for me. I just feel like sometimes we need to further define what we do, right? And in terms of like, hey, where do we begin and where do we start? A lot of these fields seem to be overlapping, and that is a challenge. And that's something that I'm really very interested in further articulating in my own research. I came from the corpus approach. I studied under Douglas Biber in Northern Arizona University and also Randy Reppin. And as Bernadette mentioned, in the past 13 or so years, I have been at Georgia State University, where a lot of my amazing colleagues have helped me further redefine and define and articulate what we mean by the corpus approach. And I always go back to this definition that we articulated, if you may. This was a quote from Biber, Reppin, and myself from 2010, that corpus linguistics is a research approach in the study of spoken and written discourse, supporting empirical, frequency-based investigations of naturally occurring language and use. Lots of things to unpack here in this definition, but I like some of the keywords. It's empirical, right? Frequency-based investigations, and also the whole idea that what we are studying is naturally occurring language in use. And in this process, it as an applied linguist, it really allows me the approach in answering a question such as what you see in the screen. How do speakers and writers across various demographics or registers actually use the vocabulary and grammar resources available in a language? That's something that's very, very important for me to be able to describe a register, right? But then this is an approach that is very technical and very scientific. And it's so important that we actually articulate what we have, define what we have completely. So what is a corpus? Well, it's a large principled collection of natural text stored on computers. It should represent particular language varieties or registers. So the concept of representativeness is very, very important. And design and size, obviously very, very important. And we have to have research questions. You know, I always say to my students that, you know, in the corpus approach, the presence of corpora or your corpus is important, but it should really originate, it should have originated from a very, very important research question, right? In terms of all of these definition, I jump always into, well, so what? You know, so this question, so what, is a very, very important question that started to really organize, if you may, my research. And this led me to further classifying the work that I do in the area of applied corpus linguistics. Corpus linguistics, I'm gonna do a shameless plug here. In the past 3 years, this is a relatively new journal, but I have co-founded the Applied Corpus Linguistics Journal with Professor Paul Thompson from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and we invite you. I'm pretty sure there are many corpus linguists in the audience right now. We do invite you to submit your papers to us. Please email me if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to introduce our journal to you some more, which would also be a topic of what I wanted to share with you today. Part of the passion that I have really focuses on my work in cross-cultural workplaces. And it's I'm very influenced by the work that has been done in PolyU, particularly with the Hong Kong Corpus of Spoken English. I'm a big fan of what they have done here with the combination of other features outside of corpora in order to further analyze what goes on in the discourse. In my over 20 years of work in the field, I have looked at outsourced call centers in the Philippines and India and many South American countries. This is something that is near and dear to my heart because I'm familiar with the register. I worked in the industry, and I'm still very much connected with what's going on in terms of analyzing the discourse. I'm also highly fascinated and relatively new to me, but I have been involved with global maritime communication, something that is very important in our region, in Hong Kong and China. And I'm actually right here in Oregon, where I'm by the Columbia River, where I see all these big ships coming from Asia, a lot of them from Hong Kong and China, passing by and going into ports here in the United States. And a very fascinating kind of interaction and discourse happening between maritime professionals communicating with local ports. I have also worked in various workplaces, but something that is very special and gave me a lot of new information was my work with augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, workplace interaction. I worked with Lucy Pickering and Carrie Bruce, and there's actually a paper that we published in 2019, published at the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics, which introduced this corpus. Many of you who are familiar with the late Professor Stephen Hawking, who used an AAC device, may relate to this type of workplace interaction. And I've worked with colleagues from Georgia Institute of Technology who are actually working on developing the tools, and they were very interested in looking at the corpus perspective in further developing AAC devices globally. And a little bit of the topic I wanted to focus on this talk today is my work with aviation English, in particular interactions between pilots and air traffic controllers. I'm sure many of you have just heard about the tragic plane crash that happened in China recently. This is an area that is really very important. We all travel. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, we've had major issues related to international travel, as everybody knows. But this whole interaction that happens between between pilots and air traffic controllers is something that is, that we have to study, something that's very meaningful, because it is not just safety, it's workplace enjoyment and contentment, and something that will actually keep us all traveling for the rest of our lives, professionally or with tourism activities all over the world. There is a book that may show you more about what I do, Talking at Work, that I co-edited with Lucy Pickering and Shelley Staples, that also shows my work with healthcare interaction, particularly in the United States. And Bernadette mentioned the Routledge Handbook of Corpus Approaches to Discourse Analyses, that also provides some of these ideas related to articulating applied corpus linguistics in the workplace. So before I go into transitioning to aviation English, just really a quick overview of what I, in a way, proposed in terms of articulating applied corpus linguistics and the analyses of workplace discourse. I just wanted to establish that it is critical, that there is a critical role of applied corpus linguistics as a methodological approach in language and social research, The goal that I see is to contribute linguistics-based solutions to and explications of societal divergences, especially during these challenging times. A lot of things going on with COVID. Our journal is publishing a special issue on COVID communication, which is really fascinating for me in terms of looking at what different countries are doing and how different media, particularly Twitter and Facebook, are utilizing the facilities of language in communicating about an important phenomenon. To explore patterning in public discourses so as to obtain fresh understanding of how language is used and construed in specific context, to focus especially upon speakers' understanding of identities, role relationships, and power dynamics at work. Obviously, as an applied linguist, I'm also a sociolinguist, as many of you in the audience could identify, and it's very important that these important dynamics are looked at, particularly power, as I will introduce and share with you when it comes to aviation communication. I have been following an analytical framework that I'm going to be quickly describing to you in this talk. It's loosely about really starting from the concept of forming research questions, developing hypotheses, developing ideas before we begin to collect our corpus. And that will guide corpus collection as we moved into conducting our quantitative analyses. So statistics, frequency-based analysis, extracting frequencies, all of these things are very, very important. But something that is, in my opinion, in many traditional corpus linguistics approaches, something that has been a little bit forgotten is the value of qualitative analysis. So I want to elevate in this sense, qualitative and textual analysis as equally important. You know, corpus linguistics obviously has this quantitative side to it, but I just really wanted to say that we are applied linguists, and qualitative textual analyses are very, very important. And so, you know, all the other measures, like for example, where do we provide evaluation and measures? It could be in the third and the fourth parts of this model that I'm providing here. This is also because I work with spoken data. It can also be an area where I provide pronunciation-specific data. For example, measures from Pratt or ALAN, some of you are familiar with these tools, could also be aligned with corpus data and corpus distributions. And that's something that I really feel should be part of what we are doing. So the articulation of that with a focus on applied corpus linguistics, to me, qualitative, quantitative, and the skill that is needed in researchers really developing the ability to, you know, successfully interpret patterns and functions. That's something that's very, very important. So I really, in talking with my students, I arm myself with statistics, with quantitative approaches, but then at the same time with all of the skills needed to properly interpret, properly analyze. So that there goes my qualitative encoding and annotation skills that will have to be part of what we do. And that's something that I feel will provide us with an holistic approach that will be useful in providing solid analyses, great conclusions, and then later on with the applications that are very important for us. So in a nutshell, corpus-based research in ESP EOP is related to what I'm going to be discussing here. Many of you in the audience are experts in English for specific purposes or English for occupational purposes. A survey of articles in many recent issues of ESPJ and Journal of English for Academic Purposes shows that linguistic and professional academic varieties or professional varieties of English are often primarily based on corpora. That's very encouraging for me. And again, it's something that I feel like the field is really accepting or moving into. at the moment. I have some commonalities and limitations that I see with all of the data and corpora that I have been working on and my current interests. I see me as very interested in L1 and L2 speaker, or if you may, native or non-native. I think we have to further unpack these terms. I know it's very, very problematic. So from time to time, I will use L1 and L2, or native and non-native descriptors in this talk. I focus on miscommunication, identifying miscommunication or communicative events, looking also at sociolinguistic features like attitudes, perceptions, power, and roles. In many of the corpora and domains that I study, there's always a performance evaluation. So for example, in the field of the domain of call centers, in India and in the Philippines, the agents are evaluated, not the callers, right? Not the customers. In aviation discourse, the international pilots are evaluated, but the local pilots, if they're in the US, are also evaluated, and the air traffic controllers are also evaluated. But it always kind of focuses on evaluation for the L2 speakers of English, or the non-native speakers, if you may. So there's something there that's very, very important to me to further look at and study. They're technology mediated, obviously, with the telephone, something that's driving the conversation, right? They're driving the discourse. They're globalized and multinational industries. Clear current corpus-based limitations. I'm highlighting ethical considerations and restrictions. When I was working with a long-term study, I've been studying call centers in the Philippines and India and many other countries. For example, Colombia and Mexico and some South American countries. The ethics and how companies are going to be very, very protective of the data, and institutional review boards were just so difficult to hurdle. There are legal constraints, very difficult to obtain data and take it as your own for sharing with other researchers. So that's a clear limitation in terms of us we're unable to share our data in many of these company-owned kinds of discourses, right? The sample sizes are still relatively small. The Hong Kong corpus of spoken English is less than 1 million words, as many of you are familiar with. My aviation corpus is just over 1 million words, but we still needed more. Contractual obligation and all sorts of other issues. And again, I'm highlighting ethical considerations. It's something that at this point, I'm still struggling to really conquer in terms of what do we have to do, what can we do to make it better. So with all of these things, I'm going to be transitioning to aviation English and aeronautical communication. I don't know how many of you all here in the call. I see about 200, close to 240 individuals in the call today. I don't know how many of you are experts or researchers with aviation English. This part of the presentation is more introductory. If you have very specific questions about what I have done, please feel free to email me. This isn't a special part of my research that I wouldn't be here doing this without collaborations, without this networking that I learned to develop and found the right people who led me into learning more about aviation English and working on various aspects of it. I'm talking about only one domain in this presentation, but we cover all sorts of sub-registers, from written to more technical kinds of discourse, and then the conversations related to pilots and air traffic controller. And I think Elizabeth Matthews and Jennifer Roberts, both from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, which is a leading aeronautical university in the US, and they have various satellite centers and training institutions all over the world as well. They have been very instrumental in collaborating with me, which led to the publication of English and Global Aviation, Context, Research, and Pedagogy that we wrote and published in 2019. We have amazing collaborators I don't know if Malila Prado, who is based in China, is here in the call, but Malila is somebody who is an expert, content expert in global aviation, and she's very instrumental in leading us into aviation and its a corpus application with pedagogy as well, in training pilots and international controllers. If you guys are interested, this book is available. Please reach out to me if you want some copies of sections of the book. If you're not very familiar, I'm going to introduce this discourse by just playing a clip that's just about over a minute. Some of you may have heard this. This is not private. This is public, and this is an interaction between an international pilot from China. Two of them actually, pilot and co-pilot from Air China, and they're communicating with an air traffic controller who is based in JFK in New York City. I'm going to play this just really quickly, and just for many of you who are not very familiar with what's going on, it's just really the use of some terms that will relate to aviation phraseology. I'm going to play it and have you guys listen to the interaction.
Air China 981, make the right turn here at Juliet, join Alpha, hold short of Mike Alpha. Yeah, right, Juliet, hold taxiway Alpha, hold it open. Now continue on, taxiway off. Make the right turn here at Juliet, join Alpha, hold short of Mike Alpha, Air China 981. Air China 981, join right, Juliet, join Alpha, hold short of the weapon. Okay, I'll say it again. Hold short of Mike Alpha, M-A, Mike Alpha, not November. Okay, hold short of Mike Alpha, 981. Air China 981, have they cleared you into the ramp? Roger, ramp to Air China 981. Okay, they have cleared you into the ramp? Air China 981, ground. Air China 981, Kennedy ground. 981, go ahead. Have you been cleared into the ramp? Okay, clear for the ramp. No, that was a question. Have the ramp people cleared you into the gate? Roger, to the gate, Air China 981. I'll try it again. It's a question. Hold your position. This is a question. Interrogative. Have you been cleared into your gate? Okay, well, hold here. Okay, how about the question? Have they cleared you into the gate?
So I believe this is a kind of like a good snapshot of what happens when it's an L2 group of pilots speaking with an L1 air traffic controller, right? And for you all who are sociolinguists in the call, you know, we're now listening to like maybe power and identity and role relationships and what's happening. And then at the same time, understanding like, hey, you know, both speakers will have needs and both speakers could be supported, right? There's always a bias, however, when it comes to who should be evaluated or who's causing miscommunication. And that's something that in my line of work, something that I wanted to avoid, because there's always this whole idea that, you know, the non-native speaker, if you may, the L2 speaker is always like the one who we should always address, or we should always help. There's always a problematized situation where the non-native speaker is causing something, right? But what about the native speaker in this context, right? What about the L1 speaker, and how is this person conducting his ways of asking a question? You know, in many of the questions by the air traffic controller is mostly repeating what he already said, when it probably, if somebody will give him a feedback, you know, probably wasn't working, right? So some of these things are very important. And if we can capture these patterns and nuances, number one, from corpora, and then later on with other methods and approaches, then we would be able, in my opinion, to properly address a situation with great pedagogical tools, great books, great materials, addressing both speakers, right? This is also why, in my opinion, applied corpus linguistics is very important, because there will always be policies related to this. If you are dealing with something that is global, we can expect policies related to it. So in a nutshell, something that's very important, a colleague, Marcus V.S. Vanger, in 2016 argued that there is the Register of Aeronautical Communication, and that's standard phraseology. These are the terms that you guys are hearing in the discourse of the pilot and the air traffic controller that have been learned by those groups of speakers, right? Standard phraseology and also plain aviation English are two distinct specialized registers of AE communication, something that we all should recognize as, again, brought about by ideas from applied corpus linguistics. We have in this area very, very specific flight deck discourse. They have to learn radio telephony. You know, there's air traffic management. So the air traffic controller needs to know all of these terms. The pilots, they also need to know all of the terms. They have to agree, they have to memorize all sorts of things, and they have to be learned. They have to be taught. They have to be tested about it. When it comes to pilot controller communication, there are very different actions. There are very different parts or terms of discourse. There are very different genres of speech that's very important in the dialogic sequence. And all of these things could be further defined by getting the exact descriptions from corpora. And that's what we are accomplishing or attempting to accomplish with a very good corpus that will represent the discourse of air traffic controllers and pilots globally. Something related to policy, and now I'm jumping again into my argument for the applied side, is that in aviation, and I added maritime communication here, both aviation and maritime communication globally are monitored or supervised by the United Nations. And they have two United Nations agencies kind of monitoring language and discourse in these areas. So with aviation, there's the International Civil Aviation Organization. With maritime, there's the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. One important area for us to focus on with the ICAO, or in the International Civil Aviation Organization for Aviation, is that they have very, very particular expectations when it comes to the language proficiency requirements of international pilots. So obviously, if you are an L1 speaker of English, native speaker of English, then you passed. You're not going to be required to have a certain level of proficiency. That's your language, right? But if you are an international pilot, like the Air China pilots that you guys heard earlier, they will have to meet a certain level. This is what we call operational level 4, which is the minimum level acceptable to ensure safety operations. This is according to the United Nations. And, I won't have time, but this slide here kind of shows you what they expect as level 4 when it comes to pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, and interaction. And again, these are metrics. These are to be identified based on performance. And if a pilot who flies internationally will not be able to pass or achieve this level, then that meant that the pilot will not be allowed to fly internationally, fly to the United States from China, or fly to Australia from Hong Kong, or something like that, right? So there are important policy expectations when it comes to this. So with this in mind, my argument, and again, my colleagues, in terms of how we feel we have to participate in the discussion, is that there is the United Nations, there is the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and they have expectations as to the language of international pilots, and also obviously the air traffic controllers globally. But, in my opinion, they haven't really articulated what happens. There's this one standard, which is, again, this is my argument, biased and favoring native speakers of English, right? Without totally understanding some of the needs and some of the nuances of communication when the speakers are not native speakers of English, when the pilot or air traffic controllers are not native speakers of English. So the argument for addressing these descriptions by collecting a specialized aviation corpus is there. So we have been collecting, right now, this is actually tentative because we don't like the acronym CPAC. But right now we're calling it CPAC. It's contributed by a lot of partners. And right now it's still relatively small, but increasing. It's over 1 million words across 750 different communicative events. It's coded and annotated. It's original, authentic material, sampling of actual language used in aviation from all over the world. We have many speakers who are pilots supplied by airlines all over Asia and South America as well. We also have interactions from training programs or simulation programs or schools that look at that teach pilots and air traffic controllers the discourse of aviation. So you know, that's another sub-register. It's intended for materials and resources production, something for training. And so this is an area where, again, I wanted more. I wanted to further annotate. We need to collect, and we are collecting more. If you are interested, this is something interesting for you. I'd like you to take a look at VAS Aviation on YouTube. They actually have a YouTube channel, and they post interactions between pilots and air traffic controllers, although many of the interactions that they have are actually more accident type or pressure packed situations, so not just the regular type of interaction, but something that will provide you with different kinds of communication, not just accidents, but also just regular question answer sequences from pilots and air traffic controllers. So based on what we have collected so far, this is the quantitative side of what we are doing in analyzing further the corpus of aviation discourse. I did a multidimensional analysis of the discourse. This is an approach in corpus linguistics from factor analysis, influenced by the work of Douglas Biber. If you have more questions about this, because I don't have time to explain, please reach out to me. I can give you materials or suggest references about MDA. I looked at a combination of other specialized spoken corpora, including outsourced call centers and maritime multicultural workplaces, U.S. healthcare industry interaction, hotel and customer service industry interaction, U.S. academia discourse, particularly those who are international teaching assistants. And we came up with this dimension, and I'm gonna only show you one dimension of the workplace discourse that I have. This is my dimension one. In terms of the two poles of this dimension, we have the separation between addressee-focused, polite, and elaborated discourse. If you can see from the positive side of this model that I have, you have a lot of second-person pronouns, longer words, lots of field pauses. I have politeness markers in here, like thanks, ma'am, and sir. There's also the word please. Here, lots of nouns in the discourse. On the opposite side of this dimension are involved production features, something like, you know, a speaker telling a story, like, you know, with a narrative, for example. There's it's first person, lots of first person pronouns. Past tense verbs are also in here. That deletion, which in a way, so this is now me trying to qualitatively interpret what happens here, right? Again, I apologize if you're not familiar with MDA. Please email me and I can point you to a very good introduction about what this means. I mean, and you know, and perfect aspect verbs. So there's this simplified narrative and very, very involved production features of discourse in here. So separating one dimension, right? So in my analyses, looking at the specialized corpora that I have, here's a sample result that we can show. And I highlighted here in orange, I don't know if you guys can see it on your screen, the CPAC corpus. So the aviation corpus landed on the positive side of the scale, which makes it closer to addressee-focused, polite, and elaborated information. This is something that is very relevant because politeness is actually, in a way, although they are not necessarily saying that this is very, very explicit, but politeness features and politeness markers are actually, in a way, discouraged or not encourage an aviation discourse. It's something that some, in at least historically, in looking at what's very important in aviation communication, the features of politeness are not suggested or not recommended as very important. But if you take a look at this, the discourse of aviation is right in this area where it's actually more polite and elaborated, right? It's similar to call centers. It's similar to hotel and service instructions, particularly in Asia. And it's similar with the language of US academia, particularly with international teaching assistants. If I look at the bottom of this scale, many of my corpora that are collected in the United States, or were collected in the United States, were on the negative side of the dimension. US, AAC, and non-AAC workplace corpus, it's on the negative. Healthcare is also negative. US workplace is very negative, which one analysis would be this dimension separates L1 and L2 interaction, or L1 discourses in primarily United States against non-US types of interaction, which is, again, one interesting pattern that, for me, requires more analyses. It's really interesting that, hey, I want to analyze this more. Remember my pattern earlier, my model earlier, where, I can go to the next level of my iterative cycle, right? So if I go into just my aviation corpus, and I separate my international pilots provided by international carriers with US and Canadian carriers, I further see that this dimension separated international pilots with those coming from the US and Canada, arguably native speakers of English. So there's another pattern here that I'm seeing from the corpus where native and non-native divide, or L1 and L2 distinction, may be contributing to how speakers are actually utilizing the discourse in aviation, even when both of them were supposedly trained in the same approach with the same type of discourse, right? So the corpus, in my opinion, and the data from the patterns from the corpus are telling me that just the native versus non-native distinction, there's something in there. There's something very special, in my opinion. And it again goes back to my argument earlier that, if the United Nations are only having one form of perspective in terms of how they analyze pilots or how they assess pilots, I agree. My position is that it has to change, because clearly there's something going on with the discourse. And it's, again, in terms of how we perceive politeness. I mentioned, I'm going back to it, and I'm going to play with you another clip here. It's just over a minute, but this is an example of, again, in terms of policy, I mentioned earlier, politeness markers were said to be not encouraged, but take a listen to this interaction between, again, international pilots from Etihad and Asiana landing again in New York City, communicating with a New York air traffic controller. Again, for I'm sure all of you are familiar with the stereotype of a New York speaker, and you can hear it in this conversation. So again, New York air traffic controllers, controller communicating with a group of pilots, primarily from Asia.
Echo in the Echo Tango 503. Where do you park? Bravo 28, sir. A taxiway, the letter. On the sir, we're on to right, holding short of Foxtrot. What taxiway do you enter the ramp? Okay, so we just exit the runway and we're holding short of Foxtrot and to right. You're not listening to what I'm asking you. What taxiway do you enter the ramp, sir? I'm not on the ramp yet, sir. What taxiway do you enter the ramp? Tell me. What letter? Okay, we can enter at Kilo for Etihad 503. That's what I need to get out of you. We talked like 6 times. Straight ahead and hold short hotel, sir. Straight ahead, hold short hotel, right? Asiana 222, turn right here, turn left onto 22 right and hold short of Juliet. Asiana 222. Quick, turn right, left onto 22 right, hold short of Juliet. The right turn, very total light, holding short, Juliet. Asiana 222. ETD 503, follow Asiana Delta short of Juliet on the runway. So we follow the Asiana, and next time I would like you to be polite to me. Thank you. Okay, but if I gotta talk to you 6 times and I got other people I gotta talk to, and you don't understand what I'm saying, what I'm saying, polite with me, all right? You are polite with me? I'll make a report. Go ahead.
So an interaction like this, obviously very meaningful for us to further unpack and study. There are a lot of things to further discuss. But again, with data like this, with data from multidimensional analyses telling us, showing us some patterns, and then a sound file like this where we can argue like, hey, you know, it's not necessarily about safety, but politeness is part of workplace interaction. That could be, you know, something that people prefer. In fact, I prefer, and many of you, I'm sure, will say is something that we want to have in our workplaces, right? So with the presence of this, there really are important policy implications that obviously global aviation will benefit from, you know, as many of these patterns, and we can get many of these patterns that could inform how we train pilots and air traffic controllers. I really would want, I'm sure some of you had questions. So are they training the New York air traffic controllers? Are they getting training with intercultural communication? Are they getting training with politeness, with sociolinguistic awareness and all sorts of things? The answer is yes, they're getting some of these. They're getting some training. You know, there are constant training before they get on the job, before they perform. But there really is, just because of the language and the discourse and the expectation, and then the socio-linguistic factors about who has power in the interaction. It defaults to the native speaker. It's similar to in my studies of call centers in India and in the Philippines, communicating with native speakers from the US or from the UK, where the customers have the power, right? You feel like, well, of course, it's customer service, you know, and the customers are the ones that are giving business to these big multinational companies. So they should have power, right? But with aviation, it feels like in many of these interactions, it's the native speaker with the power. You know, whether it's a pilot or air traffic controller, it's a native speaker of English with power. And the argument is because that has been the official language of aviation as identified by the United Nations. Again, these are some observations, and I feel like these are supported by data. These are supported by what we have obtained from Corpus. And when we do some qualitative analyses, we're able to obtain some supporting details as well. So with what I do, you know, obviously pronunciation is very important. So I am always looking at the L2 pronunciation and Corpus interface. I work with, at least here in the US, scholars who are working in L2 pronunciation. And in these contexts for English for occupational purposes, there are many of them, many of us who are working. So a question for this group that I have would be something similar to this. What are L2 pronunciation factors or issues? What are L2 pronunciation training opportunities for international pilots? And then at the same time, for us in applied linguistics, how do we improve this interface, right? I'm sure at PolyU, many faculty are familiar with a lot of managing and annotating spoken corpora, various tools like Pratt. I would like to work some more on these tools. I'm working on gesture annotation through a tool called Anvil. There's a tool that I've been using called Esmeralda. Some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. It's a corpus manager that is working with oral corpora and clear XML annotation, which is rather friendly. Some of you are maybe familiar with the CLAN program as well. They have been around, and very, very important contribution to our field. There's a tool called SALT, a little bit older in terms of its presence in the field, systematic analysis of language transcript. And you know, some of these features, I've also relatively, I'm very new to Praline, but I've experimented on it, and something very interesting for me that could align sound files with corpus data. And I feel like there's something in here for the future. As you all know, this is an area where we need more work. The work with the alignment of corpus data and spectrographic display or pronunciation kinds of approaches, that's something that we still haven't cracked at the moment. There's a lot of improvements needed for us to get better in these areas. I don't have much time, but I will obviously mention some of the work done with pedagogy. There are some textbooks in aviation English. Many of them are amazing. These are kind of like the popular ones that are available for teachers in aviation English. Not many of them would argue for corpus-based approaches. In fact, not all of them. The popular ones that you see here, they're not necessarily corpus-based. You know, it's the same kind of traditional way of here's the language, here's phraseology, here's how to best learn them. So I would argue for better textbooks in the future. My colleague Patricia Toskilux developed different kinds of approaches in the teaching of various vocabulary and phraseology kinds of modality in aviation discourse. Malila Prado worked with a colleague in looking at pragmatics in aviation discourse, which is very, very important. And so there's work being done in further defining plain language versus phraseology. And we just need to share this, and something that's, in my opinion, very, very meaningful and important. I'm going to end with this. I'm recently new to this part of my study. I haven't written this yet. Hopefully, well, finish the paper sometime this semester. But I'm working on factors causing interlocutor clarification in aviation, but this is a third-party analysis and interpretation, meaning if I were listening to a pilot and controller, and there was a clarification or a potential miscommunication, we're trying to interpret what may have caused it. This is a problematic approach, right? Because it's a third-party interpretation. But the argument is, hey, we don't have access to the actual speaker, so we can try, you know? So here's our results so far. In terms of randomly selected 40% of total clarification sequences from the corpus, so we collected about 400 samples here. I had two raters who worked with me, and they had to have mutual agreement in coming up with how they could identify the factor that caused clarification, right? So the non-native speaking pilot or air traffic controller's packaging of information is 42%. 12% is pronunciation. 19% is transmission or noise. Remember, it's through the telephone. Comprehension by the native speaker is about 17%, and others difficult to identify is about 10%, right? So initial results, really interesting. Something that jumps out here immediately is pronunciation, 12%. So the pronunciation of the non-native speaking pilot or air traffic controller, only 12% as a contributing factor in interlocutor clarification, right? Again, as identified by listeners, right? When we looked at the non-native speakers and asked them for what they thought were causing interlocutor clarification, here's what they said. 50% pronunciation and grammar, native speaker comprehension, 22%, noise and signal or transmission is 15%, and activity or product or phraseology or other information in about 10%. The quick overview here is basically the non-native speakers are blaming their language. You know, if there is miscommunication, or if there is interlocutor clarification, or if there's something that, you know, broke the flow of communication, the non-native speakers were likely saying that, oh, it's because of my pronunciation, it's likely because of my grammar, right? But if you look at, you know, a third-party analysis, it's more like it's the packaging of information. How did you frame your question? How did you frame your utterance? And pronunciation in this, as you see here, is only 12%. So very early for us, you know, something that is, I have to admit, kind of problematic in further arguing for this approach, but I like the direction of it. I feel like there's something in here, and the data is fascinating. So there'd be more here. I'm, you know, where I have a draft of the paper that I hope will come out soon. I have about 7 minutes left before 2 p.m. I'll turn it over to Sal if there are some questions.